couple of minutes after 11, so perhaps I'd better begin. Today I intend to tell you about, not about Midway Island, but about the Battle of Midway. And I do have to apologize, I don't have slides. I have one slide, which is going to stay up a good portion of my lecture. This battle changed the course of World War II. Thus, it changed world history. You can go around thinking what might have happened if the Japanese had won the battle. But, of course, that's one of the imponderables. They didn't win, and if they had, things certainly would have been different. But just how different, no one can really say. They did intend to land upon and occupy the island of Midway. But tomorrow you'll see Midway, and you'll realize that for all that effort to go over that little spit of sand, it's hardly logical. I could have shown you the picture of Wake Island and say it's Midway, and it would have made no difference. That's about the way Midway looks. It's nothing worth fighting over except for one thing. And that one thing was that the Japanese, and particularly Admiral Yamamoto, who was something of a military and naval genius, the Japanese did feel it was vitally important to destroy the U.S. fleet. And Midway was the pretext. The basic intention was to get our fleet out to fight and to sink it. And incidentally, the Japanese hadn't attacked Pearl Harbor, but only just pretended to, and given us a chance to go to sea to look for them, they'd have had their wish. And Admiral Nimitz himself said that had that fleet at that time been caught at sea, it would have been sunk at sea in deep water. Now, this is not a detailed description of the battle. I'll leave that to the professional naval experts who want to know why the ships went here instead of there and why these planes flew here and went there and so forth. What this is, I hope to give you, is a broad overview of what happened and why. Now, consider first the preliminaries. Battle of Midway happened on the 3rd and 4th and 5th of June, 1942. Pearl Harbor was exactly 6 months earlier. From Pearl Harbor to Midway, there occurred the attack on Wake and the capture of Wake, the Tokyo raid in April, and the Battle of the Coral Sea in May. Try to put yourself in Admiral Nimitz's place. He's sitting there in Pearl Harbor, and he knows that the Japanese threat to the Southeast Asia area is tremendous. That was the main area that they were intending to occupy. And they were very successful, far more than their most optimistic plans. New Guinea, Fort Moresby. New Guinea is only 100 miles from Australia. Look at the map and you'll see. The Coral Sea is the body of water between the eastern tip of New Guinea and that side of Australia. And the Coral Sea narrows down and becomes a very narrow strait. I've forgotten the name of the strait between New Guinea and Australia. And that's where the main Japanese effort seemed to be at that moment. So Nimitz was forced to send all the strength he had down there. He had only 4 aircraft carriers. He sent all 4 down there. And there's a monument in Canberra today dedicated to the United States, which stood by us at the moment of deep crisis. Read it, we have a picture of it. Now, this was the 8th of May, and we lost one of those 3 carriers. The Japanese thought they had sunk 2, but they only sank the Lexington. What happened then? Well, Nimitz already had unheard that on the 5th of May, we were pretty good at this, our decoding system had discovered that somewhere early in May, the Japanese had made the basic decision that a major fleet engagement had to be forced in the mid-Pacific so that they would then have a free reign in the Southeast Asia co-prosperity sphere. What would you do? Well, he did the only thing he could do. he directed those ships to come back at full speed. The Enterprise and Hornet arrived in Pearl Harbor about the 20th or 21st of May, having been down in the South Pacific just a couple of weeks before. Full speed, reprovisioned, refueled, rearmed, re-everything, and set out to sea immediately. On the 28th of May, they left Pearl Harbor. The Yorktown, which had been badly damaged, came back at full speed also, but she wasn't quite as fast because she was damaged. They took a quick look at her. The estimate was 3 months to overhaul her. Well, I happened to be in Pearl Harbor at that time, and I saw her come in. It was amazing. They ran her into the Navy Yard, and they ran her out again in 3 days. And on the 31st of May, she set forth. This timing is critically important. Notice this. All right, now if I may have the slide, and I'll start pointing out a few things on the slide there. Dim the light just a bit. Pearl Harbor. Midway Island. There's a chain of islands from Midway to Pearl. Down here, just off the chart, is Johnson Island, a tiny island, about the size of an aircraft carrier.
Thank you.
But not as big, not as high out of the water. Here's Wake Island. We've just come across here. This ship, yesterday and today, is traveling right over where that battle took place, right over the waters where it happened. Here's Marcus Island. Here's the mainland of Japan. And here are the forces involved. Here is the Aleutian Island. Down here, well off the chart, is Truk, one of the main Japanese bases. Now, Nimitz had one tremendous advantage. He had a decoding operation going, which Admiral Kimmel never had. And consider this situation. Admiral Kimmel, before December 7th, got information that something big was probably going to happen and he should be alert for sabotage. But probably it would happen in the far eastern area down over here, far western. Admiral Nimitz discovered that one of the primary decoding experts that the U.S. Navy had was a man named Joe Rochefort, and his headquarters happened to be in the Navy Yard at Pearl Harbor. But he was responsible to the people in Washington, and although he had radio intercept equipment, and that's why he was at Pearl Harbor, he had to send all of the information he discovered to Washington for evaluation and consideration and determination of what it all meant. And that was the situation when Admiral Kimmel was there. Well, it just happened that Nimitz's intelligence officer, who was the same intelligence officer that Admiral Kimmel had, was a close friend of Commander Joe Rochefort, who was the brilliant decoding expert. And Rochefort and Eddie Layton, the intelligence officer, were very much upset that the information Rochefort had was not getting to Kimmel, but instead going to Washington. So between the two of them, these two Navy commanders concocted an order which Nimitz delivered to Rochefort via Layton. And it simply said that I don't care what you do and who you report to, but if you find out anything at all that has any effect on my area of operations, that affects me, if you don't tell me, I'll have you cashiered instantly. Well, that's what Rochefort wanted to hear. And from then on out, he carried out orders with great pleasure. And the information not only went to Washington, but it also went to Nimitz. Washington sent information to Admiral Nimitz that the Japanese were planning something was going to happen, and they expected the attack to be on the island of Johnson Island, and it would be on the 20th of June. That's the information Admiral Nimitz received. He, in the meantime, had heard directly from Joe Rochefort via Layton that the attack was going to be the 3rd of June, and that Rochefort thought it would probably be Midway. And, of course, Nimitz knew very well why they were coming. They were coming to occupy Midway, all right. But Nimitz knew they wanted to sink the U.S. Navy. That's why they were coming. And if they were able to occupy Midway, Nimitz also knew that he would have to attack to try to drive them off, and they would have the battle they were looking for anyway. So, Midway it was. But then to be sure, to be absolutely positively sure, a neat little stratagem was employed. Nimitz had to be positive, because if he'd guessed wrong, you could just imagine where he'd have been. Supposing it really had been at Johnson, he'd wasted all his effort in Midway. At the very least, he would have been ready for Johnson, not the other way around. But anyhow, suppose he'd guessed wrong. So a private message was sent by telegraph wire to the commander at Midway. And he was told to report by radio that his water equipment had broken down and they were short of water. The basic objective of the Japanese had been detected as, or rather had been decoded as Area A, just A. A was the thing they were going to attack. And lo and behold, about 3 days after Midway theoretically ran out of water, a message was sent to add a couple of water tankers to the fleet because A was having water trouble. Well, when that happened, according to the reports, Nimitz's face lighted up like an absolute light bulb. This was the proof that he needed. Well, he had quite a bit of information about the Japanese effort, but not everything, but he had quite a bit. And one of the things he knew was that the Japanese were planning to put a submarine line here. There is Pearl Harbor now, right there. Submarine line here and a submarine line there. There's a chain of islands up here to Midway, but there was a submarine line south of it and a submarine line to the northwest. This line of submarines was to detect the passage of any heavy ships, attack them if possible, but principally to report what was happening. Now, it was vital to get his ships out there first, and he succeeded barely. He got all three of them out here. The Yorktown was the last one out. As I told you, it was the 31st of May. That line was established the 1st of June, and the ships had already gone by. So they never reported anything. The Japanese did not know that we had 3 aircraft carriers out here. Now, the Japanese did in my view, made one great mistake, one very big mistake. This was a huge, huge operation. So it was split up into actually 10 different forces. 10 separate forces under 10 separate commanders, all of them responsible, of course, to Admiral Yamamoto. Yamamoto was in the main body in this general area, in his flagship, the Yamato, and he tried to exercise control over the whole bunch. He had in his armada a total of, I think it was 192 ships. All Nimitz could produce was 30 ships. Maybe it was 32. Yamamoto had 8 aircraft carriers. Nimitz had 3. Yamamoto would have had 10, but in the Battle of the Coral Sea, where we lost the Lexington and had the severe damage to the Yorktown, the Japanese lost one small carrier, the Shoho, but their 2 biggest and best, newest, the Shokaku and Zuyakaku, were damaged. So, with the discrepancy in forces already of 8 to 3, Yamamoto decided that he could dispense with the other 2 that were damaged. They weren't brought to Midway and were instead in Japan under overhaul. So Yamamoto came out with 8 carriers, but what did he do with them? He put 4 in the Mobile force, his 4 best ones. He had 2 in this force that was going to attack the Aleutian Islands, and he had 1 here with the main body and 1 here with the occupation force. So he split his carriers up into 4 separate groups, 1 big one and 3 little ones. I've seen the suggestion, and I've thought about it myself too. Suppose Yamamoto had not tried to have all this thing done in secrecy. Suppose he had not split up his force in all these different ways. Suppose he had simply set sail from Japan with that armada of forces, 8 aircraft carriers, 11 battleships. We had about 2 of that. Something like 30 cruisers, a total of 192 ships. Suppose he just set forth from Japan and sailed to the east without any secrecy. There's no way that Nimitz or any other person, with only 3 carriers in the whole Pacific Ocean, a 4th, the Saratoga, was in overhaul and was coming out, but she wasn't out yet. There was no way that 3 aircraft carriers could beat 8, all coming at them with battleships and everything else all around, plus some very fine aircraft, fighter planes, Zeros. They're excellent. So the big fundamental mistake that I think Yamamoto made was to split his force and try to make it a very secret operation, because secrecy can work both ways, and it did in this case. We broke the secret, and they didn't know we had it. The surprise was turned around. We had the surprise on them. They did not have the surprise on us. And that, combined with the splitting up of his force, made the main part of the battle our 3 carriers against their 4. Their 4 big ones, their 4 best ones. But it was 3 to 4, not 3 to 8. So what happened? Well, the first thing was that on the 3rd of June, as we expected, there was a bombardment, an attack on Midway Island. It was pretty good. They damaged the island severely. The Marine fighters that were there took off, fighter planes. Almost all were shot down. There were some B-17 bombers. They bombed and were totally unsuccessful. They did not hit anything. The Japanese fleet was essentially unscathed. Their carriers were not even found. Midway was half destroyed. But our carriers over here, as soon as that happened, sent forth their scouting planes. They couldn't find the Japanese at first, but finally some of them did. And a very heroic thing took place, namely the torpedo squadron attacks. The torpedo squadrons are airplanes that have torpedoes slung to them, and they drop them in the water, and the torpedo runs, and it theoretically hits against the side of an enemy ship and sinks it. This is a very difficult thing to do, and it requires that the torpedo plane, during the period that it's doing this, run very, very straight, very low to the water, aiming itself at where it wants its torpedo to go, and at the last minute, dropping the torpedo and then attempting to escape. Torpedo Squadron 8 attacked, and everyone was shot down long before it got in range of the enemy. Now, when they show the movie Wings Over Water, you will see George Gay, the only survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8. He claims his torpedo actually got close enough to hit a carrier, but actually it did not. At least it didn't hit it. He survived by floating under a seat cushion while the Japanese fleet was in fact coming overhead. And by good fortune, he wasn't seen, wasn't machine gunned in the water, and he did survive, was picked up. And you see a picture of him then and now. Then as a very skinny young man being talked to by Admiral Nimitz, and now as a somewhat older man describing how it felt. It's, of course, the big thing in his life. Well, Torpedo Squadron 8 attacked, was wiped out. Torpedo Squadron 6 attacked shortly thereafter, and it was wiped out in a similar manner. The fighter aircraft and the dive bombers had not yet got into action. They had become separated, and they had lost the Japanese fleet at the moment. They didn't know where they were, and so they were searching for them. This this was quite a situation. Now, it so happened that the American commander, there were two American commanders. There was Admiral Fletcher, who was aboard the Yorktown, and Admiral Spruance aboard the Enterprise. Admiral Halsey was sick, and so he had recommended that Spruance take his place. And I think when they show the film Midway, which I expect is going to be shown aboard here, you'll see a movie version of how Halsey recommended Spruance to be the man to do it. Well, the Spruance was in command. The Japanese at this stage did not know how many carriers, if any, that we had on the scene. They realized, of course, that they were being attacked by Midway aircraft, and there's some doubt as to when the moment of truth arrived. At one point, a Japanese scout plane reported that they thought there was one carrier out there, and this changed the whole picture. If there were no carriers, then probably this great fleet action that they were really looking forward to wouldn't take place because there was nothing to shoot at. But if there were one, at least they would get that one carrier, and that would reduce the American forces down from 3 to 2, or whatever number they thought were effective. But in any case, they didn't know how many were there, and at one point, finally, Admiral Nagumo, who was in charge of this group, this Mobile force. Incidentally, the Mobile force was the force that attacked Pearl Harbor also. Same admiral, same ships. Nagumo, at some point, realized that there must be one carrier out there. He ordered immediate rearmament of his airplanes. And what that meant was, he had attacked Midway, and to attack on Midway, what they needed was a certain kind of bomb. And it was different from the bombs they needed to attack ships with. So he had held back half his force, figuring with ship bombs and torpedoes mounted, figuring that if a carrier showed up, which he hoped would happen, he'd have a force ready to go at them. But the attack on Midway, the commander of that flight, coming back to the Mobile force, reported in that he thought Midway should get another attack as soon as possible. So Nagumo ordered that all the aircraft that he had on his carriers that were loaded to attack ships be reloaded to attack shore installations. This was begun. They were in the process of frantic hurry, of course, to take off one kind of bomb and put on another kind of bomb, and bombs were piled up all over the deck of the carriers, and they were refueling the planes that were landing. That was also happening. It's about this time the submarine Nautilus showed up in the area, and although it didn't do any damage, they were maneuvering like mad to avoid possible torpedo attack from the Nautilus, and of course they were depth charging her. So the carriers were in a state of some confusion, maneuvering around at high speed, and of course all this reload operation taking place on deck and in the hangar deck. And it was at this time that, and this I think was the moment of truth, that Nagumo received a report that there were 100, and I think the report said 115 aircraft approaching from the southeast. And then a few minutes later, of course, he was consternated by this. 113 aircraft is more than one aircraft carrier could carry. This meant there was more than one carrier around. Confirm that report. I need to know it immediately. How many airplanes are there? Is the count correct? Are you sure you know what you're doing? Report came in, 103 aircraft. And then he blew up. I want this thing correct. Tell me how many aircraft there are out there. You guys, can't you even count right? And finally the word got through to him, no, sir. One flight of 113 and another flight of 103. When Nagumo realized he'd had it. He was in the worst possible situation for an aircraft carrier admiral to be in. Everything in confusion, refueling gasoline lines all over the place, and bombs lying on deck being propped up by blocks, wedges, and everything else. And the whole deck thing was in a state of absolute shambles. And the whole idea of a aircraft carrier combat is you don't let yourself get caught in that situation. And all of a sudden, here he was with 200 15 airplanes, whatever it was, coming at him. Well, in they came, and it turned out to be torpedo planes. And of course, he took off all the airplanes that he could take off. Zeros, good fighting combat aircraft. They were flying cover up high. And in came these torpedo planes, low to the water, flying a straight line to attack with torpedoes. And these Zeros just came down on them like a bunch of birds on prey, and birds of prey. And the net result was that, as I told you, all were shot down. None got through. But it so happened that in the process, all the high-flying cover planes had also come down to shoot down the torpedo planes. In the meantime, our dive bombers couldn't find the enemy. And there was a man will always be remembered, this Clarence McCluskey, was commander of the, I think it was the Enterprise dive bombing flight. And he decided the only thing he could do was to fly an ever-expanding square. And as he started flying his ever-expanding square, going around to see where the enemy was, he saw a destroyer heading northwest. Decided that, by George, nothing else I can do. This guy is going somewhere. Maybe he's heading back to the main body. So McCluskey led his flight, following the destroyer, and it led him right to the Mobile force. And the dramatic moment in that battle was when looking on the screen, dive bombers pointed up, and nobody paid any attention to him. And he kept yelling. And finally they looked up, and what they saw were planes, just the line of their wing, a spinning propeller, and they're coming straight down. They split up, they hit the Akagi and the Kaga, and they instantly burst into flames. In the meantime, the Yorktown group came in from the side and saw the Enterprise group going in, and they flew in and found the Soryu, and they hit it the same way. And within minutes, less than 5 minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 biggest carriers were in violent flame and in effect destroyed. No longer able to function, fires bursting out, bombs exploding, everything absolutely going to hell. That happened in 5 minutes, and it took something like 30 airplanes to do it. Well, there was 1 carrier left. It so happened that this Mobile Force 4 had 3 down to a little bit to the south, and the 4th one a little farther to the north, and it was not attacked. The admiral on board that carrier was one of the highest thought of Japanese admirals there were. He was considered to be a potential successor to Yamamoto. He was yelling all during this period, as soon as they had discovered 1 carrier, let's attack it now, but Nagumo said, no, we'll refuel first. And then, of course, as I described, Nagumo had his moment of truth and wished he'd followed Yamaguchi's recommendations. But anyway, Yamaguchi on the Hairyu got out a flight of planes to attack what he still heard, what he believed still was just 1 American carrier, the Yorktown. They flew out here and found her. He said he actually sent off 2 flights, one first and then with bombs, and then immediately afterward, about an hour later, the second one with torpedoes. So the outfit with bombs found the Yorktown, bombed her successfully. Most of them actually were shot down, but they did get in, and they got 3 bombs on the Yorktown and severely damaged her. She was smoking. Her engine stopped. Big hole in the flight deck. That flight reported back that they thought they'd put her out of commission and probably sunk her. Well, the Yorktown fire control crew, damage control, I would say, pretty darned effective. They patched that hole in the flight deck within an hour. And they restarted the engines. They pumped out the water, it got the thing going. She was back at 20 knots, landing and taking off planes within an hour. At which point the second flight arrived, and they thought they had found a second carrier because the first one they knew was damaged and out of commission. Actually, they found the Yorktown again. Found her apparently undamaged. In fact, a result of a lot of A lot of heavy work. So they hit her this time with 2 torpedoes, and this really finished her. She then really stopped, and they abandoned ship after no further efforts could be made to save her, and she just lay there floating. So the Yorktown was out of commission. Admiral Fletcher radioed to Admiral Spruance and said, "Look, my carrier's done. You take over and do what you can do. I'm out of battle, out of action." Spruance now had the whole command. He was junior to Fletcher, but thank goodness these guys were willing to forget all about that when something of this importance was going on. And so Spruance now was pursuing the Japanese fleet. He sent forth another attack. Now they knew where they were, of course, from the Enterprise. But he did countermand the landing on Midway. Now, of course, Spruance didn't know this. Spruance only knew that everywhere he turned, the Japanese were now going in the other direction. So he pursued at full speed, and by this time it was late in the day. After nightfall, decided that this isn't smart. He was pursuing, looking. He found nothing of any importance. So after nightfall, he reversed course, and this was the most brilliant thing that probably was done in that whole battle. He turned around in this general area now and headed back to the east. And his reasons were that he didn't know what he was up to. He knew that Yamamoto had a total of 8 carriers. He didn't know where they all were. He knew that he'd gotten rid of 4 of them, but there were 4 more to count. And he also knew that there were some heavy ships in that main body. So here was Spruance suddenly turning tail after a victorious battle. Turned out that Yamamoto, realizing what had happened, was now regrouping, and his hope was that indeed Spruance would come in here at night with aircraft carriers that could not fight at night. They could not land and take off aircraft at night. And instead, his main body with battleships, including the Yamato, which was the biggest battleship in the world, and a bunch of others as well, would, have target practice against these essentially defenseless aircraft carriers. But they never showed up. So that went down the tubes. And when Yamamoto realized early that morning, about 4 o'clock, that he'd lost all 4 of these carriers, 2 had already sunk and the other 2 were being scuttled, he then ordered a withdrawal back toward Japan. In the meantime, that night there was some confusion down here in this group. They were going to land on Midway the next day, but instead they were directed to reverse course. An American submarine, the Tamber, happened upon them, and there was all sorts of confusion then. The Tamber itself failed to attack, which it should have done, but she was seen, and in the confusion to attempt to avoid her, 2 Japanese cruisers collided. The Mogami and Mikuma actually collided down here. Next morning, as soon as day broke, Spruance had reversed course again and was again coming full speed to the west, sending out his scouts. Seeing that the Japanese were actively retreating, he found these 2 cruisers. So that was the only big target they had, and you've seen pictures of one of them. I've seen pictures of both, but one was published, the Mikuma. Absolutely plastic. How she stayed afloat through all that, nobody knows. But she sank that night. The other one, the Mogami, crept back down to truck at about 3 knots is all she could make, and she was under overhaul for over a year to practically rebuild her. But as of this moment, with this fighting going on, Yamamoto saw one more chance. He ordered all of his forces to come down in this direction and take on the carriers, which he figured by this time would be probably out of ammunition. They would certainly be weary, and it was in fact a desperate effort, but he might even then recoup. So, of course, these people up here, and incidentally, I didn't tell you that, but they did attack Attu and Kiska, and they planned to attack Adak, but they didn't. And they occupied Attu and Kiska, and then were ordered back down in this direction. But of course, it was much too far. It was 1,000 miles or more, and there was no way that they could get there. But the rest of his force was combined, coming down here, hoping to catch Spruance, and of course, Spruance was still pretty smart. Somewhere along in this period, toward the end of the day, he said, "You can't have men fighting 3 days without some kind of rest, he turned his fleet around again and again retreated back to the east. And so Yamamoto had his whole outfit grouped here, everything coming in, but Spruance didn't show up. So Spruance avoided combat a second time, with, of course, what would have been, I think, the predictable result. Well, at any rate, that was the Battle of Midway. It was not like Trafalgar, in which there were 19 French and Spanish ships captured or sunk, or anything like that. In this case, the total American losses were 1 carrier and 1 destroyer, 300 men totally killed, total of 307 actually killed, and 150 aircraft. The Japanese lost 4 carriers, 5, and 3,500 men. Well, I've left out one thing, and that is, what about the Yorktown? I last told you she was lying in this general area, somewhere in here, out of commission, listing over and abandoned. She didn't sink, so they put a crew back aboard. They put a destroyer alongside to provide power to pump out the water, and they were actually making some progress. In the meantime, however, on the morning of I believe it was the morning of the 5th, a Japanese submarine, came in and began shelling Midway. Now, the people on Midway didn't know that the battle had already happened and that the Japanese carriers had been sunk. They thought this was the preliminary to the landing that they had been told to expect. So there was considerable confusion and worry at Midway. The submarine bombarded for a while, and incidentally, these cruisers that collided had originally been ordered to come down and bombard themselves, but those orders were changed, so they never came. But the submarine bombarded, and then it received orders to go find the Yorktown. A Japanese snooper scout plane had seen the Yorktown over here. They sent the submarine after her, and after a day and a half, the submarine found the Yorktown. Now, we have bragged about how the submarine Nautilus got in here and actually sank a carrier. That's what we believed for a time, but we discovered that wasn't true. She fired a torpedo and it didn't work. But this Japanese submarine found the Yorktown, fired 3 torpedoes. 1 torpedo hit the destroyer that was alongside it and blew it up and sank it, and the other 2 torpedoes hit the Yorktown and sank it. And then the submarine ran off, and we pursued and claimed that we'd badly damaged it. First, we claimed we'd sunk it. Anyway, badly damaged it. The fact is we didn't even scratch the paint. That submarine got all the way back to Japan, and that was the only success the Japanese had. The submarine sank the Yorktown, sank the destroyer Heiman that was alongside, and that was it. But Yamamoto was in full retreat. The whole campaign was lost. His fleet badly damaged, and it was a disaster from which Japan never recovered. From that moment on, the course of the war was the reverse of what it had been. For 6 months, it was all for Japan. Everything they did worked out correctly. Their plan was that it would take about a year, and within 6 months, they'd accomplished everything they expected to accomplish. They'd taken over the entire Dutch East Indies. They'd taken over the Philippines. They were on New Guinea. They were on Guadalcanal. They had taken over all the islands of that chain, and they were a big threat to Australia. That's where they hoped to stop. They hoped that at this point, the United States and England and the Netherlands would ask for a negotiated peace of some kind. But they realized that they had to dispose of the U.S. fleet first, and instead of disposing of it, they got disposed of themselves. So that's the significance of Midway, and although the casualties were nothing like what happened in other great sea battles, the consequences, in this case, were as great or greater than any other sea fight the world has ever seen. So that's why I feel it's very important That's why I even become emotional in talking about it. It was a high point of the U.S. Navy's effort during World War II. Well, a high point in one sense. We had some other high points later. There was one high point when the submarine Piper, with me in command, was heading for Japan to win the war all by itself, but didn't get to do it. And there was another high point when the Battle of Leyte Gulf was fought, which was actually the biggest naval battle that has ever taken place in the history of the Earth. But the consequences of Midway were far greater. Midway was the battle that turned the war around and turned the Pacific back into the avenue of attack upon Japan. From there on out, Japan was doomed. Now, Yamamoto himself is supposed to have said, and this is good authority, if war starts, I am against it. If war starts, I'll run wild for 6 months, but after that, I cannot predict what will happen. Well, what he should have said was, after that, I predict that America will get so strong that we won't be able to cope with it. But no Japanese dared say anything like that. So what he said was, after that, I can't predict. The results were, as I just described, that after exactly 6 months, Japan was on the run. And there are stories in Japan to this day that Yamamoto committed suicide. The story is that he offered to do harakiri, and the emperor refused to permit him. And in that society, if the emperor said you do or you don't, that's what you did. So Yamamoto could not do harakiri. But the story is that he caused a message to be sent that he was going to go to Bougainville and inspect the troops. And this message was sent in the code that they suspected the Americans had broken. And it just so happened that a flight of P-38s sent off from Guadalcanal arrived at Bougainville within about 30 seconds of the moment that Yamamoto was supposed to arrive, found him flying in, shot him down. Sometimes I felt that perhaps it was too bad we did this, but the Japanese state of mind being what it is, the chances are he would have found some way not to survive the war. At any rate, Yamamoto, whom we hated during the beginning of the war, because he is supposed to have said that he would march up to the White House and dictate peace on the steps of the White House, actually said something very different. He knew the White House. He'd been naval attaché in Washington. Yamamoto actually said, if we start this war, and if we don't dictate peace on the steps of the White House, it'll be a disaster for Japan. And, in fact, that's what it turned out to be. Actually, if you look at Japan now, you wonder who won the war. But in those days, it looked different. Okay, that's the end of the lecture. You can put the lights back on. I'll be happy to take any questions. Yes, sir, in the back. Would I comment on the Battle of Savo Island? Gladly. Savo Island is a tiny island. We saw it on the Royal Viking Star, incidentally. A tiny island just to the north and east of Guadalcanal. The area between Savo Island and Guadalcanal and the island of Tulagi and New Georgia that are just off to the east, that area is known as Iron Bottom Sound because of the number of ships that are sunk there. The landing on Guadalcanal, our landing, the Marines were landed, I think it was the 7th of August, 1942, and on the 8th or 9th of August, I'm not positive of the dates, we had 3 cruisers, actually 4 cruisers, there were 6 cruisers, maneuvering around in that area, protecting the landing ports. There were the Australia and Canberra, 2 Australian cruisers. There were 4, there was a cruiser Chicago with them, U.S. cruiser, and there were 3 other cruisers, the Astoria, Vincennes, and Quincy, all very fine, new, relatively new cruisers that were patrolling in another group, all very close to Savo Island. The Japanese came down that night at full speed. We had destroyer patrols out, but by accident they were looking in the wrong direction. The Japanese fleet admiral's name I've forgotten, Cow, I think, but anyway, it's not important, came roaring in. And the first word the Americans had was plain language from one of the destroyers: strange ships entering harbor. These strange ships were 8 big Japanese cruisers. They caught our people asleep at the switch. They were in condition, what they called condition watches. That meant half the crew resting, the other half on station. But they were caught. They had been like this for 2 days. They were already absolutely exhausted. And they were caught with, in effect, their pants down. The Astoria, Quincy, and Vincennes were sunk. The Chicago had her bow blown off. The Canberra was sunk. And the only ship that survived was the Australia, because the admiral in it had taken off with her to have a conference farther to the south, and he wasn't even in the fight. It was a debacle first class. The only good thing that happened was that aboard the Quincy, they got off a few shots, and one of them hit the chart house of the flagship of the Japanese group, destroying the admiral's whole staff and all of his plans and everything. And so with this disaster, which was a disaster, it didn't hurt him, he wasn't there. But with this disaster, he decided not to go down and attack the transports, which was what he'd been ordered to do. Instead, he kept on around Savo Island and headed back up north. So that one shot really deflected the Japanese attack. Had it not happened, they would presumably have gone on down and attacked the transports, which had 1 or 2 other cruisers, and the Australia was down there with them. And they'd have had a free time, would have really probably, well, they would have had quite an operation going and sunk a lot of ships. But as it was, they turned back. However, we lost about, I think it was 1,000 men went down in that debacle. And the only thing I can say about it that I'm a little bit proud is that some of my shipmates on the destroyer Lee were assigned later to the Quincy, and I just hope that they were among those who got to fire that one shot. They went down with the ship. So that's Savo Island. There's a lot more to be told about it, but that's it. Yes, sir. Yes, that's the question is the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Yes, I can tell you quite a bit about that. It'll take a long time, but very, very briefly. When we landed at Leyte and brought MacArthur in, and incidentally it was the U.S. Navy that brought MacArthur in, I shall return, and the Navy will bring me. Anyway, that was, you see, Nimitz's plan was to go straight across the Pacific, and MacArthur was wanting to come up from the south. So at some point, Nimitz received orders to deflect and go down to the south and help MacArthur, which he did, of course. And so we had our whole fleet down there in the area of Leyte Gulf. And actually, the battle took 4 days, and there were something like 4 different battles of different kinds. One of them was in the Sibuyan Sea, in which the Musashi, which was the sister ship of the Yamato, slightly later in completion, was sunk. She was sunk by something, in one report, 19 torpedoes hit her, and she went down like a submarine, just planed on under. Beautiful condition, but of course she couldn't surface. And they never even stopped the engines. They just drove her on down. Battleship Harakiri. Some of the others, however, came on through the Sibuyan Sea and headed out into San Bernardino Strait. Some submarines were in there, and a friend of mine sank 2 of their cruisers. I was always jealous of him because of that. But he sank 2 of them, and another submarine sank 1. So they lost 3 of their cruisers down there. Admiral Kurita was aboard one of them. I think the Otago was his flagship. So he transferred and went aboard the Yamato, much bigger ship. That became his flagship. She came through San Bernardino and came down. In the meantime, our forces were attacking at Leyte Gulf, and Admiral Halsey had command of the fast battleships. These were Iowa, New Jersey, Wisconsin, and Missouri. They were 60,000-ton monsters, and they could make 35 knots. They had this great big lean bow, 2 stacks, lots of guns, like a porcupine, believe me, if you see pictures in those days because they were ready for the aircraft attacks. And the Japanese had laid a trap, not a trap, but a decoy. They sent the Zuyukaku, which still survived, and 2 other carriers down from the north, but they had no aircraft. They were sent down simply to draw off Halsey. And they did.
Mr.
Thank you. Well, anyway, Halsey took the bait and ran at full speed to get these carriers. He also thought there were some battleships with him. And he was, by George, going to have the world's greatest naval battle right there under his command. And this was the famous Battle of Bull's Run, as you've probably heard. He went roaring up there to the north, and in the meantime, the Yamato and 2 other ships had come down through San Bernardino Strait and were heading down, and they ran into some of the covering force that were protecting the landing group. 3 jeep carriers and 3 little destroyers. So, 1 destroyer escort and 2 destroyers. At any rate, the Yamato attacked. Admiral Kincaid was in charge down there, and he sent a message to Nimitz saying, "Where in the Sam Hill is Halsey and his big battleships? I need him." And a message was sent to Halsey saying, "Where is Task Force 34, which meant the battleships. But in those days, we had a system to make it more difficult to decode the messages. You put garbage at the beginning and garbage at the end. So, for example, the message might say, "Joe Palooka says," and then it says, where is Task Force 34? And then it would say, "Joe Palooka doesn't know." But in this particular case, what it said was, "Where is Task Force 34? The world wonders." And Halsey had given an order that whenever any message came in of that general nature, they weren't to just carefully retype it on a piece of paper the way you're supposed to, and they were ordered to rip off these little stupid little things because they had no meaning and they would be distracting. But in this case, they ripped off the strip of paper from the decoding machine and brought it right up to Halsey, and they did not tear off the world wonders. It was separated XX, the world wonders, but that didn't make any difference. Halsey, who is not known as a man of small temper, is supposed to have thrown the greatest tantrum on the bridge of a battleship that any man ever threw. He screamed and hollered and ranted and raved. He took his hat off his head, threw it on the deck, and stomped up and down on it, hollering he was resigning right then and there. He's going to go and catch Nimitz and boil him alive. He was really fit to be tied, but what could he do? He turned around and headed back at full speed, and of course when he got there it was all over anyway. So all Halsey got out of that was expenditure of fuel, a lot of energy used up in his own personal. And I think his sailors actually liked him the better for it. I might add, just a little bit, it's a long answer, but anyway, the Yamato came down and attacked these jeep carriers. The 3 destroyers attacked the Yamato and the other battleships. They all 3 sunk. 2 medals of honor are awarded to the skippers. I don't know why the 3rd didn't get one. He should have too. But anyway, the jeep carriers, one of them was sunk by long-range guns. But Admiral Kurita was his name. Admiral Kurita, aboard the Yamato, had been up for about 3 days. He'd been torpedoed and sunk in the Otago already. He was not only exhausted, but it's my conviction that you lose some of your judgment when you're in a condition of continual pressure like this. You don't function as well. Anyway, he decided that maybe these carriers were bigger than they seemed to be. And probably there were more over the horizon, so he better get out of there. So the Yamato and her ships turned and headed away. So in effect, they were repulsed by 3 little destroyers and 3 jeep carriers that didn't have any airplanes. So this was a disgrace for the Yamato. And it's my theory, although I don't know this for sure, that the use of the Yamato in her final sortie against Okinawa was an opportunity given that battleship to regain her honor, because she was a disgrace. Any further questions? I think perhaps... Now, this is the last of my formal lectures. I will be telling you about the Tritons Around the World cruise, showing you some movies that we took on that trip. And, of course, I'm available at any time to replay any of these naval battles. I think I can do it. Thank you very much.